Okay, this video again, I'm going to apologize for the lighting. Again, just make sure you're listening to what I'm saying. This video is going to talk about some of the different weapons that were used during the Revolutionary War. The one you can see on the screen right now is your standard musket. And as I mentioned early, or in one of my earlier videos, that barrels of these guns, so right down here, the barrel, some are smooth bore, which means they have nothing on the inside. Some will have rifling, which means there's grooves on the inside that give it that bullet or musket ball, that spinning effect to make it go straighter. And each musket will have on it a bayonet, which looks like this knife-like thing up here that could have been used in defense if you were being attacked. So this is an example of what a musket would have looked like. Here are just some different examples of swords that would have been used by officers, those in charge. And I did forget to say at the start of this video, if you ever want to look at a picture a little bit longer, go ahead and pause it so you can see the picture. But here are some examples of swords used by officers. Some different examples of muskets. You can see some are smaller, some are larger than others. And in this case, this would be an example of a Kentucky long rifle, which was used by Patriot soldiers, which was a little more accurate than the muskets used by the Redcoats. This is just an example of a sword with the scabbard that it would have been held in. And I'm going to go back to that picture in a second. Washington wore this battle sword during his years as general and commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He later bequeathed, when you bequeath something, means you give it to somebody, to his nephew, admonishing him to draw it only in self-defense or in defense of the country and its rights. So I had those in backup order. So this is Washington's sword. So again, pretty cool that we have the Washington sword is still available for people to look at. And here's an example of a different sword. So this one was not Washington sword. The last one I showed you was Washington sword. This is a different officer sword. Not only muskets were used in the war, but so were cannons. And what we call a cannon is part of a larger group called artillery. Artillery has two different things. It has a cannon and a mortar. And I'll talk more about the difference between the two as we go here. A cannon, like this, shoots two different things. It shoots either a cannonball or something that we call a canister. And I'll show you pictures of both of those. Cannons like this are used for two things. Either to shoot at enemy soldiers as they're attacking, or to shoot through walls or forts or things like that. Cannons are named by the size of the cannonball they shoot. Could be 3-pounder, 10-pounder. So the weight of the cannonball determines where they are. Cannons are on wheels for two reasons. One, they're easy to move, pull them with a horse, things like that. And two, when they fire, they're going to recoil. So they're going to want to roll back a little bit. And so it's best to have them on wheels. So here's an example of a cannon. And going now, switching back to muskets here. I didn't put these pictures in any order, so I apologize. So as I mentioned in the last video, here is an example of a powder horn. So that is one way that soldiers would have kept their powder, their gunpowder dry to use to load. So these are muzzle loaders, so they load from the barrel. Down here, this little part here is called the ramrod. So you're going to put the musket ball down from the top of the barrel here and use this ramrod to ram that down the barrel to get it down here. And over here is the pan. We're going to pour some of your gunpowder into that pan. And then you pull this, you cock this hammer back here. When you pull the trigger, that hammer comes, creates a spark, hits the gunpowder, explodes, and causes the bullet to shoot out the rifle. So these pictures I'm just going to go through because they just kind of talk about what some of these things are in the next picture here. Here's just another example of a musket and a sword. And it talks about the Minutemen there. Just a reminder, we learned about that when we talked about Lexington and Concord. And that was just a nickname for the militia that could get ready in a minute's notice. Here's another example of a powder horn. And it was very common for the soldiers to engrave things on their powder horn. kind of help them keep track of who they belong to. And these up here are just some examples of flint that, flint and steel you learned at Wolf Ridge can be used to start fire. In this case, it would have been used to help maybe shoot their muskets. So a couple different things here. This bag looking here is called a cartridge pouch. And it's where you keep your bullets, your musket balls there to help keep them dry and a place to store them. Down here, this is a bullet mold. So you can make musket balls out of this. You can melt lead, and it's hard to tell, but there are little like ball-like things there. So when you put the lead in there, you seal that shut, and you're going to get a musket ball like that. This here is another way to store gunpowder. It would come in little pouches like that. So these are all important things that they would need in order to fire their weapon. Here's another example of bullet molds. You fill these with hot melted lead, so it's in liquid form, and then you would collapse them on top of each other and let the bullet harden, and eventually you open it up and you have lead in the nice perfect musket ball form there to fire out of your gun. Here's just an example of a knife that somebody made out of, I believe this was an elk antler. And here's just another example of a musket ball, and I'm going to read this to you. In an earlier video, I said 3,000 musket balls came out of that statue of King George III. They toppled over. Wow, I wasn't even close. This musket ball is believed to be one of the over 42,000 musket balls that came from the statue. I was a little bit off. The ball's composition of lead and tin matches the combination of lead and tin found in the surviving pieces of the statue on display in this case. Archaeologists unearthed this ball at the site of the 1778 Battle of Monmouth, New Jersey. This discovery is evidence that Revolutionary soldiers fired pieces of the statue back at the British. So there is the musket ball they believe is made from the statue of King George III. Here, I should have moved this to a different spot. I meant to. Sorry, I didn't. This is just a canteen that would have been used by a soldier full of water. I should have had that with uniform and equipment. So I have that in the wrong spot. Here's an example of a cannonball. Fires out of a cannon. As I said earlier, cannons were named after the weight of the cannonball they would fire. Now, these would do a lot of damage to soldiers and armies as they were advancing. They would have been used by what we call the infantry, soldiers that fire on fight on foot. But artillery is a separate thing, and artillery refers to cannons and mortars, as I said earlier. Just some examples of cannonballs you can see here. This top one is a 3-pounder, and this bottom one is a 6-pounder. So whatever cannon fired them, that's what we call that cannon. Well, that cannon's a 3-pounder. That cannon's a 6-pounder. Refers to the size of the cannonball they fire. So zoom in here. You can see the 3-pounder compared to the 6-pounder. Pretty good size difference. Here are just some different examples of weapons that would have been used by the Navy. So those that are on water, they're not going to need as big of muskets as the soldiers on land do, the infantry. So these would have been used by sailors. Now these things down here could also be loaded into cannons and fired. Now they're not going to be fired at people. These bottom row here, they're going to be fired at the mats, the poles that are holding up the sails. Because if they go through those sails, they're going to rip down those wooden poles and drop the sails, and now the ship can't sail. Because that was the only way they could really get around back then, was through sails. Here's just another example of a cannon. Now it says it was from Lafayette. Lafayette is somebody we have not learned about yet, but he's a Frenchman that will eventually come to help, and we'll learn more about him later. Same with the Battle of Yorktown that it mentions on here. So these are some pictures that I also took. I believe these were also at Fort Ticonderoga. These are what we call mortars. Now, mortars and cannons work the same, but mortars are different. Mortars are designed to go up and over something. So designed to go over walls of forts, not through them. So that's a big difference between cannons and mortars. Cannons go through things. Mortars go up and over things. Here's the inside of a mortar, just looking down. So the mortars also do their cannonballs they fire are full of more explosive gunpowder. So when they hit, they'll act like a bomb and they'll explode on the inside. So this is looking down the barrel of a mortar. Here are just some more examples of some different styles. Swords, and if you were an officer, you probably would have had a smaller pistol like this one. If you're going to have a pistol and a sword, you don't have the hands available to carry a big, long musket. Again, some different size examples of cannonballs. Now, here are cannonballs. Here are mortars. You can tell the difference between a mortar because a mortar is going to have this opening here that you're going to be able to pour gunpowder down there. So these are cannonballs. These things over here are something that would come out of a canister shot. And I'll explain more what a canister shot is in a little bit. But just remember these little balls that I'm talking about right here. So here's another example of a mortar. And again, you'd put one of those cannonballs down there that would have gunpowder inside of it. And so when it lands, it's going to explode and cause a lot of damage. So here's just another cannonball. Now this is an 8-pounder. So this cannon would have been designed to shoot a cannonball that weighs 8 pounds. This is a swivel gun. Typically, these would be on forts or maybe on ships. And it's called a swivel gun because right down here is a pivot point. So it can spin and turn. So it's a lot smaller than a regular cannon because it has to be able to spin and you have to be strong. It can't weigh too much, otherwise you can't spin it. So here's just, as I mentioned earlier, some of those mortar shells, those cannons that had the hole in them. You would use a funnel like this to fill it with gunpowder. So you'd put that in the hole, dump the gunpowder down there, and you'd have a little thing like this. So the gunpowder would be going down into this. This is a fill it in here, and then you're going to put this thing in here to seal it in there. And then when it's time to fire it, you pull that out, you put a fuse in there, you shoot the mortar, and when it lands, it'll explode, causing a lot of damage. So this is what I mentioned earlier, the case shot or canister. Remember that long row of balls that I told you to look at? These are made of iron. It's in a funnel like this. You can see all the little balls in there. What happens when you fire it, all those balls are going to spread out and act like a shotgun shell. And they're going to spread out and hit many soldiers that are attacking. So people that are operating the cannons will go from cannonballs to these canisters or these case shot as the soldiers get closer. So this is one from the Revolutionary War time period. This is what we call a reproduction. So one they made to look like they would have at the time. So this is more modern. This is one from the actual war. So case shot or canister were very deadly as the infantry soldiers moved closer. And then this is just the part of another example of what the inside of a mortar would have looked like. So the cannonball or the mortar shot would rest in here, and then this is how you would light it. There'd be black powder in here, gunpowder. You light it, and it causes the explosion. And just an example of sometimes cannons get so hot, they explode. And that's what happened to this one. It got overused, got overheated, and the iron that was made out of just exploded. So they can no longer use that one. So that's just a little bit on about the big pieces of weaponry that was used during the Revolutionary War. You had muskets, you had rifles, little pistols used by the officers, swords, and also at the end of each musket would have been a bayonet, a knife-looking thing that they could use to attack an opponent with. We learned about artillery, and artillery is made up of cannons, which shoot cannonballs or canisters or case shot. And we also learned that there's mortars. Mortars are for going up and over things, and they shoot exploding cannonballs. If you have any questions about any of the weaponry that I went over today, please call me or shoot me an email, and I'd be very happy to answer. For now, take care. Bye!